That means that there's something in the human heart itself that is warlike, and somebody's got to win, somebody's got to lose. Maybe philosophy can mediate the apparent war between religion and science. Well, that's especially important today because the standard narrative defining our whole modern Western civilization is a fourfold narrative. On the one hand, the rise of science. For the last 500 years, we've been getting better and better at it. It's our proudest achievement. We are vastly superior to every other culture in the history of the world there. And that part of the narrative is absolutely true. Secondly, for the same period of time, roughly the last 500 years, there has been an increasing decline of religion. And that is also true, at least in Western civilization, although not elsewhere in the world. And because of those two things, like a rising line and a falling line on a graph, which are almost mirror images of each other, the third part of the standard narrative is that there is a causal relationship between the two, that the rise of science is the main cause of the decline of religion. And I think that's probably at least a half-truth. Psychologically, that's probably true. Science is like money and power. The richer you are, the less religious you are. Poor people are more religious than rich people. And the more power you have, the less religious you are, because if you can play God, why do you need God? That says nothing about the truth or falsity. It does say something about a psychological connection, so I admit even a partial truth in that part of the narrative. But the fourth part of the typical narrative about the relation between religion and philosophy is that the rise of science is the reason, the justification for the decline of religion. That science has refuted religion. And I think that is simply and absolutely false. The so-called war between science and religion is a fake war. It's a myth. There is not a single casualty of that war. If people talk about the war between science and religion, I insist on moving from the realm of vague, safe abstractions to the more scientific realm of carefully defined specifics. Which discovery of which science, made by whom, where, with how much validity, has refuted which dogma of which religion, correctly understood how? I have never found anybody to give an answer to that question. Well, in order to defend my answer, we have to do something rather boring but necessary. We have to define our terms. We have to define religion, we have to define science, and we have to define the alleged conflict between them. So let's start with religion. It's a difficult term to define in general. It certainly can't be defined as belief in a god, because Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism doesn't have a god, but they're religions. So let's confine ourselves to Christianity, since that's the major religion in Western culture and the one most of us are the most familiar with. And let's talk about Christianity in principle rather than in practice. G.K. Chesterton said the one really strong and valid argument against Christianity is Christians. Well, that could be said about any religion. You know, we're only human. But it's the principles, the beliefs, the dogmas that, according to the standard narrative, are refuted by science. All right, what do we mean by science? Well, there's an ancient definition of the term, according to which philosophy is a science. That is, any body of ordered knowledge through causal explanations. But modern science is much narrower than that. Modern science is probably best defined by its method. What is the scientific method? It gradually came into clarity beginning towards the end of the Middle Ages and in early modern times. And I would say that the method of science, or the modern scientific method, as distinct from the method of both religion and philosophy, can best be defined in 7 ways. First of all, what Descartes calls universal methodic doubt. A scientist treats ideas in the opposite way that we treat people in our courts. Guilty till proved innocent. You don't accept the idea just because you like it or because somebody in the past taught it, but because it has been proved to be true and the opposite has been disproved. Secondly, science deals with problems rather than mysteries. What are problems? Problems are things that can be defined clearly and distinctly. Problems are things that are not subjective but objective. Why does Romeo fall in love with Juliet, and why do people behave so badly are not truly scientific questions. They're mysteries that we're so personally involved in that we can't be totally objective about them and detach ourselves from them. They're great religious and philosophical questions, but they're not really scientific questions. And finally, problems are things that can be solved. You can come to an end of them. I don't think you ever come to an end of the mysteries of religion or philosophy. Thirdly, the primary way of thinking that science uses is analysis rather than synthesis. Although there is a place for synthesis and a big picture, nevertheless, the scientific method is basically the concentration of consciousness in a sort of laser kind of light, enabling it to cut through almost anything. There's a place for floodlight consciousness, as well as spotlight or focus or laser consciousness too, but they're strikingly different. And most of the progress of science has come about through that intense specialization. Fourthly, science tries to quantify everything. An exact science is a science in which everything is quantifiable. For two reasons. One, mathematics is the universal language, and two, mathematics is the only language that is totally unambiguous. Fifth, all theories and hypotheses are tested by the data, not vice versa, unlike political ideologies. And preferably, the data must be empirical. Now, in a sense, religion also accepts that principle of the scientific method, but its data is not empirical. At least three religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, believe that there is divinely revealed data, and its theories or its theologies must be tested by that. But that's not empirical data, so that's not truly scientific. Sixth, data are sometimes artificially engineered by active experimentation. Francis Bacon is probably the single mind most responsible for that aspect of the scientific method. And finally, its conclusions are always open to revision. There's nothing sacred and unalterable in science. Its glory is it is open to, gee, I was wrong, let's do it over again. That's the scientific method. It obviously contrasts to the method of philosophy in many ways, and it contrasts to the method of religion in many ways. That's fine. The method of choosing a car is different than the method of choosing a dessert. So is the claim that religion contradicts science talking about the scientific method? I don't think so. There's no contradiction there. You can have different methods. It's talking about results. The results of the scientific method, the discoveries, at least some of them, of science are alleged to contradict some of the essential principles or dogmas of religion. And the conflict must be defined objectively rather than subjectively. Obviously, there's a conflict in many people's minds, or feelings, or attitudes, but that's not what we're talking about. And we're talking about the conflict now. In other forms, there were conflicts in the past, not so much between religion and science, because science in the modern sense is only about 500, 600 years old, but between religion and philosophy, science in the broad sense, but I'm not going to talk about that. So now let's define the battlefield. Where do these two things meet? Well, first of all, they most importantly meet in that they share a common goal or end, and that is truth. Here, take these four human enterprises: science, technology, religion, and magic. Do a little mental experiment. The psychologists say that you can tell how people are thinking by how they behave. For instance, psychologists often classify people as structuralists or functionalists. They'll classify and organize things in either of those two ways, by what they look like or by how you can use them. For instance, in a nursery school, you tell the kids to put their toys away and give them two boxes and say, put the toys in these two boxes. And let's say there's four toys there. There's a baseball, a basketball, a baseball bat, and a basketball backboard and hoop. The functionalist will put the basketball and the basketball backboard and hoop in one carton and the baseball bat in the other carton. The structuralist will put the two round balls in one carton and the two non-round things in another carton. Neither classification is right or wrong. It's just different ways of thinking. All right, I'm going to ask you to do that with these four toys: science, technology, religion, and magic. Which two fit together? Most people would say that science and technology fit together in one place and religion and magic in another. And there's good reason for thinking that. Science and technology both use the scientific method. Religion and magic do not. Science and technology both deal with natural things, not supernatural things. Religion and magic both deal with supernatural things. So that's not a wrong classification. But I think a better and profounder classification is to put science and religion in the same category and technology and magic in the other, despite the fact that they think in different methodological ways, because the end, the goal of both science and religion is truth, whether it's truth about nature or truth about supernature. In both, the mind wants to conform itself to objective reality, whether it's the objective reality of the universe or the objective reality of God. Technology and magic, on the other hand, arose at the same time in history. There was very little magic in the Middle Ages. Many people in the Middle Ages believed that magic was possible, but they didn't do it. They thought it was wicked. Magic arose first. There's a lot of magic in Renaissance times, and it didn't work. But technology worked. But magic and technology both have exactly the same end, namely the control of objective reality to conform to the wishes of man. Rather than conforming ourselves to reality, let us conform reality to the self. And that's neither good nor bad in itself, but most early modern thinkers like Bacon and Descartes explicitly say that previous times were naive in thinking that the contemplative end was the highest one and we should know the truth for its own sake. No, truth is for power. If you have the truth, you have power. Power over nature. Transforming nature into something more desirable, something more pleasant, something more conformable to our wishes. So I'm not going to talk about technology. I'm going to talk about science, or pure science, versus religion. In the Middle Ages, there was a problem, an apparent war, not between religion and science, because modern science was just beginning to get off the ground there, but between religion, all three major religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and philosophy, especially the philosophy of Aristotle, whose works were rediscovered in the Middle Ages. There were at least three important contradictions between the philosophy of Aristotle and the beliefs of both religious Jews, Muslims, and Christians. Number one, Aristotle denied that the world could possibly have been created or be finite in time. The world always was. Secondly, Aristotle denied individual immortality, life after death. Thirdly, Aristotle denied divine providence. There was a kind of a deistic God, a prime mover, but he would not lower himself to deal with inferior things like human life. He was a sort of a snob God. And the philosophers of those three religions were confronted with the problem that apparently the smartest man who ever lived contradicted their religion on three essential points. So there did seem to be a war there. There were three basic answers, no, maybe four basic answers. No, just three. Sorry, my math is not very good. Three basic answers that emerged then. One of them was that Aristotle was right, and religion was literally interpreted wrong, but you shouldn't interpret it literally. Common people might do that, but we experts know that when our religion conflicts with the greatest mind who ever lived, it has to change, so let's not take that literally. We can still teach that to the masses, but the elite understand that the higher truth is Aristotle. But religion is still good, it keeps people in line. You don't find that mainly in Judaism. You find that much more so in Islam, Averroes, for example. And you find that to a certain extent in the double truth theory that Thomas Aquinas so assiduously opposed in Siger of Brabant. A second answer was a kind of retreat into conservative fundamentalism. You know, if Aristotle contradicts our religion, he's wrong. We're not going to refute him. We're just going to forbid that you deal with him. Don't deal with the problem. Aristotle's dangerous. The third answer, by far the most fruitful, typified by Thomas Aquinas, was truth is one, and truth cannot contradict truth by definition. And if our religion is true, and if the discoveries of Aristotle or anybody else are true, then they can't contradict, even though they seem to. So let's analyze the contradictions, the apparent contradictions. And with regard to Aristotle, Aquinas said the eternity of the world is really presented not as a certainty, but as a likelihood. Aristotle doesn't prove it. And according to Aquinas, he doesn't even claim to prove it with certainty. So that's an open question. With regard to providence, Aristotle is simply wrong. He doesn't understand what a good God would be. He doesn't understand that to know inferior things in no way lowers you. Aristotle is a bit of a snob. And with regard to immortality, Aristotle fudges it a bit. He could be interpreted as open to it. He could be interpreted as closed to it. So Aquinas very carefully and in a nuanced and quite technical way negotiated those three things because he was priorly convinced that there couldn't possibly be a contradiction between truth and truth. And if there was, well, then we're in big trouble. But by definition, truth contradicts only falsehood. Aquinas also thought, as most Christians do, that religion was the friend of science because it established two of the fundamental philosophical presuppositions of science. One was the intelligibility and the clarity and the orderliness and the rationality of the world. If the world didn't just happen by blind chance, but was designed by an intelligent God, then clearly science has a profounder foundation, which is why you don't have much science in polytheistic cultures. There are many gods. They contradict each other. They didn't design the world. Anything can happen. And secondly, that the human mind was also designed by God. That human reason was part of the image of God in man. If you deny intelligibility or if you deny intelligence, you don't have science. And the same God is the metaphysical foundation for both intelligibility, and intelligence. But what do you mean by truth? If the battlefield is truth, and truth can't contradict truth, might there be two different kinds of truth? No. Good old Aristotle, master of common sense, gave the best definition of truth. This is a masterpiece. I think I counted the number of words in his definition. I think it was 47 or 49. They're all words of one syllable. If one says of what is that it is, or if one says of what is not that it is not, then he speaks the truth. But if one says of what is that it is not, or if one says of what is not that it is, then he does not speak the truth. Wonderful. All other definitions of truth presuppose that one. It's usually called the correspondence theory of truth, the correspondence between our minds and objective reality. To say that truth is really coherence, not correspondence, is to say that real truth corresponds to coherence. To say that truth is just what works is to say that truth really is what works. That is, there is a correspondence between our idea of what works and what works. You can't get out of that definition of truth. And to be skeptical of truth is always self-contradictory. To say that you can't ever get this truth, you can't ever correspond your mind to objective reality, is to say, well, I've corresponded my mind to objective reality, at least in this one case, to know that I can't do it. And however you nuance skepticism, there's no objective truth. Well, is that objective? There's no absolute truth. Is that absolute? There's no universal truth. Is that universal? You can't get out of that. Simple skepticism of truth as such, is simply self-contradictory. However, skepticism of religious truth is not necessarily self-contradictory. And even skepticism of moral truth, or moral subjectivism, or moral relativism, is not necessarily self-contradictory. I think it can be answered, but it's not. The simplest definition of insanity is not being able to distinguish the subjective and the objective, and to see end fact. It's also essentially idolatrous. Only God can say that. I have ADD and I get bored very easily, especially with sermons, so my favorite sermon of all time is the shortest one I ever heard. God supposedly preached it to a late medieval mystic, St. Catherine, when he said, I'm going to summarize all of divine revelation in 4 words. There are only 2 things you need to know. Number 1, I'm God. Number 2, you're not. Love it. We keep forgetting that second thing. Well, let's look a little bit now at the history of the war, so we can finally end up by taking account of the major battlefields in the so-called war today. You did have a genuine conflict between philosophy and religion in Greek philosophy. In fact, the philosophers and the priests dressed differently, and they walked down different sides of the street, and they wouldn't talk to each other in public. That's how polemical they were towards each other. Socrates and Plato and Aristotle all got in trouble because they couldn't literally believe in these many obviously foolish, wicked, stupid projections of our own fallacies onto the gods. They were all in some way or other monotheists. In contrast, in the Middle Ages, philosophy and religion, at least for the mainline philosophers, were friends rather than enemies. And in fact, the seeds of the scientific method were all planted by late medieval thinkers like Albert the Great and Roger Bacon and John Buridan. Unfortunately, in Islam, in the 9th century, Islamic civilization was centuries ahead of Christian civilization. So they discovered Aristotle centuries earlier than the Christians did. There was a fundamental conflict between the Mutazilites and the Mutakalamun, or the Asherites, The Mutazilites believed that Allah was always rational, and his will conformed to reason, and the Ash'arites said that's not true. Reason is totally dependent on God's will, even in morality. If God said, hate your neighbor, that would be right. A thing is true or right only because God wills it. Unfortunately, the Ash'arites won, and ever since have become the typical mainline Muslim theologians. They're not the only line, but they're the main line. They didn't have a Thomas Aquinas to negotiate the two. Philosophers often talk of this as the Euthyphro problem. There's a Platonic dialogue called the Euthyphro, in which Socrates asks Euthyphro the question, is a thing good because the gods will it, or do the gods will it because it's good? And Euthyphro says, a thing is good only because the gods will it. And Socrates says, oh, I don't think so. I think if the gods will it, it must be good if they're really gods. In other words, is the will of God the supreme reality, or is the reason of God always consistent with the will of God? Can human reason participate in this divine reason and understand the will of God, or do you just have to obey it because he's the boss? Euthyphro thinks the latter, and majority Muslim theologians agree with Euthyphro. I think the majority Christian theologians agree with Socrates. Aquinas has a very simple reason for believing that philosophy and religion can never conflict. It is that God is the origin of both. If God invented human reason and sort of programmed that as part of his divine image in man, and if God also designed and created the universe, then the two fit together. He's the common father of both. If that's not so, then either the universe is irrational, or God is deceiving man, or God is not the author of truth. It was a kind of medieval cliche that God wrote two books, nature and scripture. And since this teacher never contradicted himself, there could be nothing discoverable in nature that could, in principle, contradict anything in scripture, if both are divine revelations. A corollary of that belief is that, therefore, every apparent objection against any religious belief that comes from philosophy or science has a fallacy in it somewhere, has a mistake in it somewhere, and is in principle discoverable and refutable. That's a large program. That's essentially the program of apologetics, which Christians are commanded to do. Scripture says so. Is it 1 Peter or 2 Peter? Be ready to give a reason for the hope that is in you. That's been going on ever since. Toward the end of the Middle Ages, there were controversies about the relation between religion and science. The most famous one is, of course, the Galileo Controversy, which was flawed by stubborn people on both sides. Galileo was right, but he said nothing more than Copernicus had already said, and Copernicus was a priest and approved by the church. By the way, Galileo was also funded by the church, good friend of the Pope. The controversy was not theoretical, but practical. Galileo insisted that he was infallibly right, and this was not just a hypothesis, and the Pope said, no, you can't say that. Galileo was put under house arrest. It was a practical mistake, but it was not nearly as big as most people think. And it was not a mistake in principle. The stupid bishops who refused to look through Galileo's telescope at the sunspots or the craters on the moon were, of course, stupid, but there have been stupid bishops ever since Judas Iscariot, who was the first Catholic bishop who took a government grant. Today's battlefields, I think, are, well, there was a battlefield in the early 20th century, which is no longer a battlefield. There were three theories about the origin of the universe. There was the steady state theory, which was basically Aristotle's notion that the universe has always been here. And there was the oscillating universe theory, which is basically the universe is an accordion. It expands and then contracts. And then there was a third theory, the Big Bang theory, which was invented by a Jesuit priest, which says that the whole universe came into existence as a singularity once and for all, and time is only finite. And once that became known, most scientists said that's disguised religion, that's creationism disguising itself as science. There's not a scientist in the world today who rejects Big Bang cosmology. It's simply right. So that's pretty dead. But I think the two main battlefields today are the theory of evolution and artificial intelligence, which seems to show a kind of materialistic relationship between the body and the soul, reducing the soul to the brain, being able to explain all supposedly immaterial things like thought and feeling and choice and even mystical experience in terms of brain chemistry. Evolution, it always surprised me as a Catholic, and even as a Protestant, why religious people were so afraid of the theory of evolution. I always thought that the account of the creation of the world in Genesis was not only compatible with evolution, but almost clearly taught it. Because the word for create in Hebrew, barach, which is a word that doesn't exist in any other ancient language except Hebrew, because the Jews were the only people that believed in a single God who had such omnipotent power that he could create the entire universe out of nothing whatsoever. So man is not creative. You can't say man creates anything. You can say he makes things, but not creates. That word is very rarely used in the Bible. It's only used 3 times in Genesis. The so-called creation story is really largely a formation story, where God says, let the earth bring forth, or let the seas bring forth. It's used in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's the Big Bang. It also said God created living things, or beasts, creation of life. And finally, God created man in his own image. But Genesis also says that God didn't create, but formed or shaped man's body from the dust of the ground. Dust is a symbol for stuff or matter. So that certainly suggests evolution. And the evidence for evolution is empirical, and it's basically a fossil record, and that seems to be pretty clear. But there are no soul fossils. Evolution doesn't explain souls. Souls are not bodies. They don't leave fossils. There's no empirical evidence for or against the biblical notion that God creates each individual human soul out of nothing at the moment of conception. So I see no contradiction there. I don't know why so many millions of tons of ink have been wasted over that issue. Some fundamentalists say that the Bible says that God created the universe in 6 days, but they couldn't possibly be 24-hour days for very obvious reasons. An hour is defined by the motion of the sun and the earth, and if they weren't created until the 4th day, then the word day is meaningless for the first 3 days. The word in Hebrew, yom, often means a long period of time. For instance, Yom Adonai, the day of the Lord. That's the time when God will establish his kingdom through the Messiah. And that's not a 24-hour period. So the days of creation can be interpreted, and were by many of the church fathers, as long periods of time. In fact, St. Augustine has a kind of primitive theory of cosmic evolution. He says that God planted seeds in all things, and those seeds took a long time to flourish. And you can't see them at first. They're just potentialities. And then they become actual. He didn't apply that to biology, as Darwin did, but the idea is perfectly consonant with both Bible and Christian tradition. So I see no problem there. If God wanted to create everything snap, snap with his fingers, he could have done it, but his usual style is to use second causes. Because he's not a micromanager, and he likes to insult his subordinates. I think probably the main battlefield today is artificial intelligence. Is intelligence an artifice? Do computers think? Is the mind nothing but the brain? The argument for saying yes to that is the amazing success of cybernetics in supposedly explaining all supposedly spiritual behavior in physical ways. Imagine two columns. This is the body, and this is the so-called soul or mind or spirit. And if you believe that we are in some ways dual, not simply material, but also something immaterial, whatever the relation between those two, whether it's two substances, as Descartes thought, or simply two dimensions, which is much better, I think, as Aristotle thought, still we're not just machines. If you believe that, then apparently, here's the argument, apparently you have to be able to point to something in the so-called spiritual column that can't be adequately explained in the material column. Okay, can you explain in terms of brain chemistry or brain physics, whether it's the wet model or the dry model, how people sense, of course, how people calculate, yes, you can do that. How people make choices, yes, you can do that. How people feel, yes, you can do that. Let me poke this part of your brain with an electrical rod and I can make you see purple demons swirling over your head. Even religious experience, even mystical experience has been explained cybernetically. That portion of the brain which usually fires doesn't fire in mystical experience. I got a Danforth to study Zen Buddhism in Japan, and one of the Zen masters explained to me very clearly what mystical experience is like. I was kind of hungry. It was the middle of the afternoon. The monks had all eaten. He said, "Would you like some lunch?" I said, "Yes." He said, "We have lamb stew. You like lamb stew?" I said, "I love lamb stew." "What do you have, Irish monks here?" And he said, "Well, help yourself in the kitchen. It's in the big black pot, big black kettle on the fireplace." It was a big, enormous kettle on a still blazing fireplace, and there was a lid on the kettle, and it was obviously very hot. I said, "Do you have something to take the lid off?" He said, "No." I said, "Well, how am I going to get at the lamb stew?" He said, "You're not." I said, "But your monks ate, yes." "Well, they must have had a hot pot holder." "Yes, they did." "Oh, well, you're not going to eat one without one." "No, I'm not." "Oh, well, that's what Zen Buddhism is." "What?" "Yes, it's a hot pot holder." He said, "Imagine the mind. It has delicious things inside, but there's a lid on top for a good reason. And that lid is the rational thinking, the ego, the way we cope with the ordinary world, defining things, thinking about things. Mystical experience happens only when you get rid of the ego. And Zen Buddhism is a technique, a kind of yoga that does that. It gives you a kind of controlled mental breakdown to get the pot off and let the mystical stew come out. Well, quite apart from Zen Buddhism as such, I think that's a very interesting psychological principle, and it apparently works for religious or mystical experience. It's not that the brain does something new when you have a mystical experience, is that it stops doing something old. It stops classifying and ordering things in a dualistic, objective way. So you can explain even mystical experience. On a number of occasions, mystics have consented to be hooked up to electroencephalograms, and it was found that their alpha waves increased, but their beta and theta waves decreased during mystical experience. Alpha waves are evidence of awareness, consciousness, awakenedness, and they're usually accompanied by strong either mental or emotional waves, beta or theta, I forget which it is. But in this case, you had almost no beta or theta waves, but you had strong alpha waves. Well, that's a nice, convenient explanation of even the most spiritual experience. So, isn't that evidence for materialism? I don't think so. Because you could equally say that just as you the materialist, can explain everything in this spiritual column by something in your material column. I, the immaterialist, can explain everything in your so-called material column by the spiritual column. Now, I'm not a Buddhist. Most Buddhists believe that matter is just a projection of consciousness. It's a dream. It's not really out there. You could use the parallel between those two columns to prove Buddhism as well as to prove dualism. If you want to insist that Occam's razor, always use the simplest possible explanation, works not only in science but also in philosophy, then the simplest possible explanation is Buddhism. There's only one thing. It's consciousness, mind. It's not split into little parts. There aren't persons. It doesn't have objects. One thing is not different than another thing. There's just mind, and everything is a dream in mind. That's a very simple explanation. It can't be refuted, because whatever matter you point to, you're pointing to it, and that's a mental act. Now, I don't think most people here are Buddhists, and I don't think most people here do believe that matter doesn't really exist. So you're not convinced that that argument proves immaterialism. Well, then why are you convinced it proves materialism? Well, doesn't psychology at least explain religion? Doesn't Freud have a pretty good explanation of religion as based on the fear of death and the fear of losing your father, who gave you the two things you most want, namely protection and answers? And once you realize your father died, you can't hack it anymore, so you invent an invisible father in the sky. Yeah, it's a pretty good explanation. The fact that what our spontaneous needs and desires are, and what religion gives us, fits together like a glove in a hand. That's very impressive. But of course, either the hand could be made for the glove, or the glove could be made for the hand. C.S. Lewis used the same kind of argument to prove the existence of God. It's the argument from desire. If all of us have a desire for something that we can't get in this world, if all of us have a lover's quarrel with the world, if all of us are dissatisfied no matter how comfortable our lives are, if we want something that we can't define and we can't get, and we call it God or heaven or union with God, what does that show? Well, the most likely explanation is this. Every other innate desire, a desire not conditioned by something like advertising, but something that's universal and innate, every other desire corresponds to something real. If you went to some other planet and found a race of monosexual beings that kept falling in love with a non-existent second sex, you'd say that's very strange. Or if you found some robots that didn't have digestive systems that kept hungering for a steak, you'd find that very strange. Every hunger that we have that's innate corresponds to something that could satisfy it. And this deepest of all hungers, isn't it at least very likely that it too corresponds to something that cannot satisfy it, something beyond this world, which is the common principle, I suppose, of all religion. So that argument, like the two columns, can work either way. Maybe it doesn't prove the existence of God, but it certainly answers the atheist objection. And that's all I'm trying to do today. I'm not trying to prove the existence of God today, I'm just asserting and challenging you to refute me when I assert that no discovery of any science has ever refuted any dogma of any religion. So, I'm finished. Your turn. Questions, please.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Kreeft. You've given us a lot to mull over.
Yeah, so at this point, we want to open up for questions. And so just a reminder that questions are open for everyone. And to come down, right down here, and we'll have someone holding the microphone. Kirk. This is Kirk. So just another reminder to keep your succinct and to the point so many people will be able to ask. And this is Dr. Kreeft's favorite part of the night, so please don't be shy.
you have no questions, I shall consult you by telling you my favorite Aristotle story. Why is this? Oh, there it is. Okay. This was from Diogenes Laertius' gossiping Lives of the Great Philosophers. It's about as reliable as the National Enquirer, but it's a good story. Aristotle, like Plato, used the Socratic method. And after each lecture, he wanted questions, so he could get involved in this discussion. And once his students let him down, and they had no questions. And he said, if you were following my lecture, it was about levels of intelligence in the universe. According to my philosophy, there are three. There is human intelligence. There is animal intelligence, which is not as rational as human intelligence, but is much greater than most of us think. Aristotle was the first to experiment on animals. He kept a zoo. His student Alexander the Great brought animals from all over the world to be studied. And then there's the intelligence of the gods, about which we know little, but we know one thing, that they must be much more intelligent than we are. Now, you can distinguish human intelligence, I think, from that of animal intelligence and divine intelligence by the very same empirical fact. We always observe human beings asking questions. Animals ask no questions because they know too little. The gods ask no questions because they know too much. Now, if you have no questions, shall I congratulate you upon having risen to the status of the gods, or shall I insult you upon having sunk to the level of beasts? And after that, there were questions. So let me assume there were some human beings in the audience with questions.
Check, check. Okay, thank you so much for coming. My question is about ethics, and specifically the branch of ethics dealing with our environment, our Earth, the resources we have. What would you say should be the Christian's response to environmental ethics, environmental issues, and that kind of thing? How should Christians respond?
Well, I think the commonsensical and not merely Christian response to that is you start with ethics and you apply it to the environment rather than vice versa. Ethics is not a part of the environment is a part of ethics. We live in this planet, it's our home, we're responsible for it, it's terribly important. I never understood why conservatives, people who call themselves conservatives, weren't in the forefront of the movement to conserve the planet. So I think we do indeed have responsibilities to the environment, but I start with ethics and apply those basic principles of responsibility and care for other people and the use of the world for human reasons, not for its own sake, to that question. And as with most ethical questions, there are two extremes to be avoided, either irresponsibility or overconscientiousness. We must not worship the earth. It's not more important than we are. On the other hand, we can't ignore it.
Hello. Okay. I just want to let you know I have a stutter, so it might take me just a tad if I want to say something, but I'll be good. First of all, I just want to say thank you. I really like this topic of science and religion. And I really enjoyed your talk. I really got it. Because I really enjoyed it. And so the question I want to ask is a very specific question. But like the nature of the question would require a full conversation. So rather than asking for an answer, I want to ask for your opinion on the thought process behind it.
Rather than an answer, what do you want?
Or, as opposed to an answer to the question, I'm looking for like your advice on the thought process about asking the question. Okay, so I'm recently coming out of a researching phase between Islam and Christianity in terms of science, like just in the context of science. And the result of my research, just from my personal opinion, it directed me to like Islam as a religion compatible with science. But like of the tenets of Islam, you're supposed to believe like the Bible was at least at some point.
Sorry to interrupt you, but
Yes.
I'm getting old and I can hear you okay, but you're talking a little too fast.
My apologies.
I talk too fast. Slow down a little bit so I can get you.
I apologize. I get excited. Okay, so the results of my research pointed me towards Islam over Christianity, but not necessarily against Christianity. And so, as like Muslims are supposed to believe that like the Bible has the truth in it, and from a science perspective, it definitely has accuracies in it. But just for the sake of like the many different directions I can go with this, I'm just going to bring out examples in which I came up with my conclusion. And so, for instance, in the Bible, it was mentioned that the universe was created in 6 days. That's fine. And then in the Quran, it was mentioned that it was created in 6 days, while the earth specifically was created in 2.
Yeah, I addressed that in my talk. Days are probably to be taken literally.
But the reason, so I brought this example specifically in the context of Christianity, and just in the context of how I'm thinking. Because when the current estimations of the age of the universe versus the age of the Earth, it's really close to 1/3. The age of the Earth is approximately 1/3 the age of the entire universe.
I don't think that's an open question. I think pretty much all the scientists in the world are pretty much agreed about the age of the Earth and the universe.
Yes, and so in the Quran, it specifically says that the Earth was created in 2 days, while the universe was created in 6, as opposed to the Bible specifically saying 6. Obviously, these are just examples, and so to get meaning from these examples, the conversation.
Only fundamentalists have a problem with that because they insist on interpreting everything in the Bible literally.
Exactly.
In other words, this is my body.
I completely agree. And just my second example, just to make sure that my examples are consistent, is that when describing the creation of the sun and the moon, in the Bible it says it creates the sun and the moon as a, I don't think the word is bigger, but it's like bigger and then lesser.
I didn't get your word.
In Genesis, when it describes the creation of the sun and the moon, it describes the creation of the sun as a bigger light or a larger light. I forget what the exact word is, and then the moon as a lesser light.
Well, I don't want to interrupt you, but I think all your questions are questions of how to interpret biblical language.
Yes.
And I think the Bible should be interpreted in the same way that other books are to be interpreted, namely, you have to ask the question, does the author mean it literally or figuratively? And there's a very simple answer to that question. If he claims to have been there, or talked to somebody who has been there and has seen it with their eyes, interpret it literally. If not, don't interpret it literally. Well, all language about God cannot be interpreted literally because God is a spiritual being and is not visible. So God has a strong right hand. That doesn't mean a physical hand. It's a symbol for power. And language about how God created the world cannot be interpreted literally because there weren't human beings there until the 6th day to observe it.
I didn't claim to understand everything, but I did get your jokes. The question that I have, if religion is not opposed to science, I got that thing about putting religion and science in the same box as looking to truth. Then is it right to go the other way around, that if you are religious, you might actually be a better scientist? Because if they're both pointing to truth, would you be better off being religious to improve your science? And would science help you with your religion?
If I understand your question, is it possible that an atheist is a better person than a religious believer? Is that the question?
The question is, would being religious help you with being a good scientist?
Oh, being a good scientist. Oh, not necessarily. That's like, would being religious help you to be a good surgeon? When my daughter had a brain tumor, which we thought was malignant, we found the best surgeon around. He was an atheist. And when we discovered that the tumor was not malignant, but benign, and he got it all out, he was amazed. He said it showed up on the CAT scan as a different kind of tumor entirely. We had a lot of people praying. I think it was a miracle. He was open-minded enough to say, I don't know. I can't explain it. But he was a crackerjack surgeon. And if we had gotten a surgeon who was a little more religious but not quite as careful, he might have left a little bit in there. So I don't think religion is going to make you a better practicing scientist. It's going to make you a better thinking scientist because you know the basic grounds for science.
Yes, I meant discovery, in terms of discovery, not so much as
Right. It'll also give you a motivation for science. Truth is sacred. Truth is one of the things God is. Many people think truth is relative, truth is negotiable. I think any believer in the Judeo-Christian God has to say there are at least two absolute absolutes, truth and love. Never sin against either one. And that will certainly help you as a scientist.
I just have one question. It seems like to make this question work, you have to kind of like throw fundamentalism out, or like if the Earth was really created in 6 days, it seems improbable. But one thing that keeps coming up, like as I'm being a Christian, would be, I guess, one of those dogma or anti-science things is Jesus Christ fully man and fully God, like they just discussed in like the Council of Nicaea when they try to figure out how to work Christ in, and it seems like it seems to be a core tenet of Christianity that has to be absolutely taken on faith, and I see that as a huge problem in this question. That that's one of the biggest questions I've had, and I think about quite often.
Well, you focused on the central religious issue. That is the thing that distinguishes all Christians from all non-Christians. If you don't believe that, you're not a Christian. If you do, you are. And although that's not a question of science, it's certainly a question of logic and philosophy, and it certainly seems to be irrational. How could the same person be both divine and human? Eternal and temporal. Well, you're both visible and invisible. Those are opposites. They don't contradict each other. Do you have a visible body? Yes. Do you have an invisible mind? Yes. Okay. Now, why do Christians believe that Jesus is divine? Well, he said so in many different ways, in all four Gospels, by the historical records. So he either is or he isn't. Okay. If he isn't, then a man who claims to be God and isn't God is either insane, if he sincerely believes that he's God, or he's the wickedest and most blasphemous liar in the history of the world. Now, if you look at Jesus' personality, if you look at all the human side of Jesus, almost nobody says he's the wickedest man in the world or he's insane. So if he's not either a lunatic or a liar, then you must trust what he says, however difficult it is. And I think the resurrection is a pretty darn good proof of that. Could you raise yourself from the dead? Could you? Yeah.
I tried again.
Good luck.
I was gonna have a follow-up, but now I kind of spaced out. If you give me just a second. So I guess when I asked that question, I guess C.S. Lewis kind of like was where I first read, like he's either insane, he's either evil, or he's telling the truth. And I guess from a scientific perspective or a psychologist, I've heard like, oh, he's like schizophrenic or some sort of basically deceiving. So I don't.
There's a psychological paradigm for that. You know, schizophrenics, egomaniacs, people who think they're God. The Divinity Complex is actually an identified and diagnosed kind of insanity. You'll find it in manuals of abnormal psychology that are very thick, but not that are very thin. There were 3 people in the same insane asylum in Ypsilanti, Michigan, about half a century ago, who each claimed to be God incarnate. And a reporter persuaded the head doctor to allow him to interview them. And the book is called The Three Christs of Ypsilanti. And what was interesting is how uninteresting they were. They were boring. Now, you may be able to fake intelligence, you may be able to fake morality, but you can't fake interest. Jesus was the only human being in the entire history of the world that never bored anybody. I think that's a pretty good indication that he wasn't one of these really boring schizophrenics. Oh, I'm God, believe me, believe me, believe me. They're not into you, they're into themselves. He's into everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, for the talk. Really enjoyed it. My question is at some point of your talk, you told us that.
You'll have the microphone a little farther from his mouth because I can hear you better if it's not so loud.
You told us that the the study of evolution does not oppose the Catholic belief of creation. But the current scientific theory believed that there were multiple human species like the Neanderthals and the Sapiens, and many human species were there initially. And at some point of time, it is the cognitive revolution that made the people who we are today from the apes, that made the transition of the apes to the humans, right? So doesn't that raise multiple questions, like at which point was the soul? Like,
Oh yes, it certainly does raise that question. And there's no clear answer to that question. Were Neanderthals human or were they subhuman? We don't know. So I don't have any answer as far as I know. Nobody else does either. But somebody must have been the first one. I mean, maybe they were not Adam and Eve of the Garden of Eden. Maybe they were Olga and Helga in a Norwegian fjord. But H2O is H2O no matter what its state. But once it boils, it's not a liquid anymore. It's a gas. And at some point or other, the first molecule is released when water boils. And that's Adam, that's the first man. I think that physically, he's made of the same stuff as prehumans. And yet, it's in a change of state. And we just don't have good enough data. We don't have eyeglasses that are strong enough to go back that far and find out exactly when it happened. But perhaps the closest empirical piece of data that we have is that humans make art. They don't just make tools. Animals make tools sometimes, but humans make art. Those Lascaux cave paintings, those are done by human beings.
thank you.
For the next question, we just have time. We want to be conscious of your time, just for 2 more questions.
Well, maybe 4 more.
Okay, we'll do 4 questions.
I try to be quick. So I have one question from non-Christian perspective because I'm not Christian. Many years ago, I heard one interesting story. In that story, some strong religious people in the U.S. Said schools should not teach theory of evolution or Darwin to their children. But I was very surprised at their argument. But do you think is it reasonable or extreme?
All right, could I ask the man with the microphone to summarize that question because I didn't hear most of it. I'm getting old.
Do you think it's reasonable for schools to there's been a religious argument to exclude the theory of evolution from education. Do you think that is reasonable or not?
No. The purpose of education is to explore all things. Crackpot theories, true theories, everything. That's the great thing about a university. It's universally open. No censorship.
Hey, thank you for coming and teaching us. It's great. My question is dealing with evolution. And so you talked about the formation of time, how the first 4 days, you don't know how long they were. There was no day and night. It establishes that in Genesis, but the creation of man was after that. And so how does evolution fit into that? Because my personal view is that with evolution, species adaptation, of course it's correct. I believe the theory of current evolution. However, with the origination of man, the fact that we came from an ape or a Neanderthal, and the origination of the soul, I believe that started with Adam and Eve. We were made in the image of God. And
so what's the question?
My question is that how do you find evolution correct in the fact that we would have evolved from matter when time was in fact established after the 4th day and man wasn't created until later than that?
Well, that's symbolic language. The author of that inspired poem looks at it from an anthropomorphic point of view. If someone was standing on the earth, there would be periods of time which he would call days and nights. I don't take that literally. I think it's inspired, I think it's true, but you don't interpret poetry as if it's science. A fairy tale can be true, but it's not empirically or scientifically true. Different kinds of truth. Once you get to Genesis 11, once you get to Abraham, you get historical figures and times and places and dates and names of kings and eyewitness descriptions. There the Bible becomes very literal. I think you can interpret Noah's Ark as a fable rather than a literal eyewitness description. I'm not sure of that. That's a borderline case. But pretty clearly the Genesis creation accounts are highly poetic. That's not to say they're not divinely inspired. That's not to say they're not true. It's to say that they're not scientific.
So responding to that, if we go back by, how is it, the physics of time, how relativistic, say our days are getting longer, and so, as time goes on. If we go back to this timeline, God established that there's day, there's night. He distinguished the day, and man was created after that. Even if we push back time the millions of years, we'd still be looking at a shorter day than a longer day. So how does evolution fit after day and night was established? God said, and on this day I created man in my own image.
I think I already answered that question. I think the question assumes a literal meaning of day and night, which I do not assume.
Even though God established it after, God created man after he established what day and night was. I can understand the first 4 days.
Of course he did. We're latecomers.
Yeah.
We're only 50,000, 100,000 years old. That's a snap of the fingers compared to 13.7 billion years.
Exactly. But the creation of the soul, if we're not made in man's image, the idea of the evolution creating man rather than God doing that, it doesn't. I believe evolution in the species adaptation. You see Darwin's The Finches. That's obvious proof of it. But going back to
that prepared the matter. That's like sandpapering the wall. That's not yet painting it.
All right. Thank you.
It's fertilizing the field.
Hello, thank you very much for coming. Mine is, I guess, a more philosophical question. I know that, like Plato and Aristotle, and it's also in Christian philosophy that what is most real, in a sense, is the spiritual realm, or non-physical things. And so, would you say that there's a philosophical reason for caring about the material world if it's less real?
Oh, okay. In one sense, matter is just as real as spirit. It exists, but it's got more being in it. It's solider. It lasts longer. It's the explanation of matter. Why does an artist arrange his colors or his sounds in this material way? Because he wants to produce this spiritual effect. That's the important thing. So since spirit is much more important than matter, materialism is mistaken, not just as an explanation, but as an ethic. However, matter is important. The human body especially is holy. It reflects God's image. So once again, you have two opposite mistakes. To say that matter is everything, and to say that matter is almost nothing. It's not as important as spirit, but it is important. God made it. He declared it good.
So one of the pillars of Christianity is that you always practice deep faith in God's plan and the things that we learn in church. While one of the pillars of science, of being a good scientist, is you constantly question everything and you're skeptical about everything around us. So my question is, how can you have faith without being constantly questioning God's plan?
Oh, well, just as religious faith doesn't say you must have faith in the latest scientific theory, so science doesn't say you must question everything outside of science as well as inside of science. There's a place, even for the atheist, in human relationships for faith. You trust each other. Imagine a conversation between two atheists that follow the scientific method. It rained a lot today. Oh yeah? Prove it. Conversation stopper. Scientists, or rather, scientific atheists often criticize Christians for being obstinate in their faith in the face of evidence. There is evidence against religion. The amount of evil in the world that we can't explain. We don't know why God allows so much of it. And that is a serious question for anybody who believes. So why do people maintain their faith in the face of, if not proof to the contrary, at least strong evidence to the contrary? Well, because they have even stronger evidence for it. Suppose a policeman came in this room and said, Professor Kreeft, you live in Newton, Massachusetts, right? Yes. Your wife is Maria? Yes. Well, we've got her in jail. She just chopped the heads off of 3 neighbors with an axe. I would laugh. Why? Do I have evidence? No. Do they have evidence? Yes, we have an eyewitness who certifies that, and she's going to be tried for murder. No, she couldn't possibly do that. Why? I know her. You don't know her. Oh. There's different kinds of knowing. There's scientific knowing, and there's personal knowing. And religion is personal knowing. So part of that is trust. How do you know your best friend? By psychology? By scientific study? Or by trust? Let's say you got 2 friends. One is very bright and is a trained psychologist and wants to use you as an example of a book that they're writing. So gives you some free psychoanalysis every week for 10 years and knows every in and out of your personality. But he's not really a good friend. He wouldn't die for you. And your other friend is a rather simple-minded and uneducated person, but he loves you truly and dearly and would die for you in a minute. Who knows you best? Second one. First one knows you in a different way, scientific way. Nothing wrong with that. But religion is about the second thing.